I would like to just do a quick talk about each of the components that make up the airbrush and talk about what's unusual about them, what's special about them. And so it makes sense to start at the back. You don't want to be dismantling the front and still have the needle sticking out of the front of the airbrush, so I'll work from the back. Now, the handle itself has been designed by us. It's designed so that the protective cap, the crown cap, can be removed and screwed onto the back of the handle. So you've got a fully exposed bullet head front and you're not going to lose your protective cap. When you have finished, you can then screw that back on to the front there. The handle is solid brass. It is not aluminium. Aluminium, when screwed onto brass, causes electrolysis and it eats away the thread of the handle and eventually the handle falls off. So we're not prepared to be involved with aluminium parts being fitted to a brass airbrush. The needle chuck. This needle chuck, a lot of the brands have a habit, if you turn them more than one full turn, that they fall off and roll across the floor. This needle chuck, you would have to turn it 6 full rotations, 6.5, before it'll actually fall off. So you can give it a full turn and it won't fall off across the floor. Even the needles themselves, they're really nice and thick, and there's been a tendency with a lot of the brands of airbrushes in the world that when you pull the needle out, that it's actually quite easy to bend the needle itself, the needle shaft. By having it this thick, it means that you're not going to bend it. Where it matters, it's been thinned down and it's as thin as any other airbrush needle in the world at the front. So we have all of the advantages at the front of a long, thin taper and a nice thick shaft that won't get bent. Now, the rear needle return spring assembly, there's quite a number of very significant features. Firstly is that the back lever has a Teflon sheath pressed over it, and that means that the trigger is rocking against Teflon, so we have self-lubricating plastic between the back lever and the trigger, and the spring inside has been custom made for us. So we designed the spring. We wanted a specific number of turns, so we had the die made for the stamping out of the back lever, and we have the springs custom made for us. So you can't, these are exclusively made for Airbrush Supply Network. The springs are exclusively made. There are quite a number of quite unique features. But the point of it all is to have a pressure adjustable spring. There are clear increments on the outside of this housing, and you're able to wind it in or out of the airbrush to get exact tension on the trigger. Now, the fact that the back lever is attached to the actual shaft is fantastic. It just makes it so easy to put in. You lean it forward like that and you push it all the way in, and then you get it to hook up underneath, and then you pull back on the trigger and trap it, and then you can just screw this in. It's very, very easy, and what you're doing is you're then winding it in to the actual number of increments. So the softest setting is the 6th ring there, and when the handle's on, you've got yourself a very, very soft trigger action. Very, very soft. Then you can wind it in another increment to the 5th or the 3rd, until you get what you want, and that makes the trigger action stiffer. And you can just keep going. The finer the line, the more you tend to want to stiffen up the trigger action. But if you're doing textures and you're wanting to rock the trigger very, very quickly, just for rough textures, then you'd want to soften the trigger action so that you get exactly what you want. So yeah, you're just winding this in and out to get the exact setting. So this entire trigger setup is most unusual. This is the spring is unique, the outside housing with the increments marked so you can set it, the nylon coat, Teflon self-lubricating plastic. The trigger is the largest in the world, and it's been designed for a number of reasons in this way. It has a completely flat top, there's no knurling, and that's so that people can do a number of things. Firstly, they can go to hardware stores and buy the soft foam with the adhesive underneath it, and they can cut it out and stick it on there and have a really nice soft foam top to it, and there's a flat surface for it to adhere to. Or people can actually get a Dremel and actually reshape the trigger so that they can actually custom shape it. There's a lot of airbrush artists that like to create their own shapes that they find comfortable. It's one of the reasons why it's been made so thick there. But the other thing is that by making it this thick and nice round edges, it means that if you do want to hook your finger on the front and pull it right back, that it's very, very comfortable to do. Right. Now, it's worth noting for those that when you take the trigger out and you're wanting to reassemble it, that there's a round face for the front. There's flat faces for the back and the sides, but there's a round face for the front. Now, we specifically need you to be able to identify which is the front because we have a unique ball and socket set up for the bottom of the trigger here, and it's actually been just slightly turned 1 degree, and that slight turn means that it's got to be set up the right way. So I'm just going to pull the trigger, the back lever back, and put the trigger back in, and make sure that it's sitting on top of the ball and socket. The idea of the ball and socket I want to show you, and while I'm doing it I also get to point out something else that's unique about the airbrush. This is the world's first spanner removable air valve. It's specifically designed so that you're able to get the spanner on and undo the air valve, and by being able to remove the air valve you're able to clean all of these mechanisms. The number of times that people get ink down inside their trigger well and it starts to actually glue up the plunger, air valve plunger, and the trigger action, and so it's important to be able to keep this all beautifully clean. But the whole point of taking this off was to show you that modern CNC technology allows us to machine a perfect ball and a perfect socket that sits on that, and it's fantastic. There is absolutely no slop. They are absolutely precisely matched, and it just creates the smoothest trigger action you could imagine. The other thing is that with most air valve trigger mechanisms, when you press down, the trigger actually grinds on the top of the air valve body, and most airbrush brands actually design it that way, and it leads to wearing away the air valve body and eventually the trigger jamming inside the air valve body, And this has been specifically designed so that the trigger only is rubbing against the ball, and so it again just creates a much better trigger mechanism. There's quite a bit of work's gone into getting this just right. So, as I was saying, we have a spanner removable air valve for the cleaning of the top of the air valve mechanism when you spill ink down inside the airbrush. And I've shown you the ball and socket trigger pivot point. So that's the back of the airbrush. I've talked about the needle release chuck, the return spring housing, the actual spring itself. I've talked about the back lever and the nylon coating. We've talked about the ball and socket and the spanner removable air valve, and we've talked about the specific shape of the trigger. There's a lot more to this. A lot of people don't control the trigger of an airbrush the right way. They actually tend to raise this pivot, this joint of their finger. They raise it up and they try to operate the trigger with the tip of their finger. And with our airbrush, you don't. What you do is you place that crease at the back of the trigger and you operate it by pushing down at the back, and it leads to a much more precise control. So the size of the trigger and the shape of the trigger has been designed so that people are trained in the Venturi classrooms to not lift and pull, but to actually push with this joint rather than pull with the tip of their finger. It's only a small difference, but you'd be amazed at how more in control you would feel. Anyway, so I'll now talk about the front. We have a very special slot there for the spanner to actually sit in. It doesn't fall off. It's designed to actually key into it, and you remove the housing that holds the fluid nozzle onto the front of the airbrush. Now, this is a floating nozzle designed airbrush. Now, floating nozzles mean that the nozzle just sits inside a conical shape at the front, and it's held into place by this air cap here. With all of the brands that have taken this, there's been a problem with the nozzles actually jamming inside the air cap, whereas these have been designed to actually wedge into the body, and this key here, this square shape, is designed to actually then release the nozzle from its wedged in position. And so there we have our floating nozzle. There's no thread on it, it's not screwed in, there's no sealing tape required or anything. And it means that you're able to get inside and clean it out very, very quickly, as I demonstrated in the other video where I dismantled, cleaned and reassembled the front in 60 seconds. So we have the special feature where the nozzles are specifically designed to wedge into the body. The conical taper here means that we have an incredibly efficient venturi forming at the front of the airbrush, and this is as good as anything on the market. And so this bullet head, that we'll call it, when you take the protective cap off, although this protective cap has very deep cuts into it and the air is able to actually entrain right on the very leading edge of this air cap and the fluid nozzle, when you do remove that cap, it increases the efficiency again of the airbrush and will get you even finer lines. So when you put this on, make sure that you put it on tightly. One of the most common mistakes that people new to this airbrush make is that they don't do this up tight enough. You've got to make sure that you really give it a good hard tighten, and hence why we're using stainless steel instead of just mild steel. And then you can screw the protective cap on if you wish. Right, loosen the needle chuck, guide the needle in, do not just randomly stab, and do up the needle chuck and put the handle on. And there we are. Don't forget to set the tension at the back here. So tighter when you want to do fine lines and softer when you're wanting to do very fast fur and other things like that. You can wind that in and out without adjusting this, that doesn't matter. So there we are. Now, what I've done so far is explain everything about what the square notch is and the spanner therefore. This is just a key ring. We don't want you losing these spanners, and so we want you to purposely put it on your key ring. Do not leave them lying around or leave them in your airbrush kit. So you can see I walk around with mine actually on my keys. As much as this airbrush looks like a normal airbrush, to someone who's done a lot of airbrushing with the various brands, major brands of the world, this airbrush feels very, very different. And as a result, it takes a little bit of getting used to. The trigger is a very different shape and feel. The adjustable spring creates a very different feel. The fact that this airbrush with a 0.38mm nozzle will do a line as thin as a hair. People keep talking about the finest nozzles and the longest needle tapers, and it's not rubbish, but it's not really that important. And if you actually design an airbrush properly, you can take a nozzle that is considered to be a medium to large and yet do incredibly fine work, and at the same time do very broad spray for flat basing and clear coating and things like that. Even the hose itself is a challenge to what people are used to. They're either used to really thick, stiff hoses, or they're used to the ultra-fine, really flexible hoses that are easily damaged. Now this hose is a fairly thick hose, and yet it is very, very flexible. And it doesn't kink, and it doesn't have a memory. And so this is a fantastic hose material. It's also much stronger than the superfine hoses. So this has the flexibility of a superfine hose, and yet is much, much stronger and long-lasting. The springs on the end here to help protect it, to stop it being damaged. We have had a lot of problems over the years with the hoses getting damaged when the airbrushes are dropped and splitting at this point here. Even at this end here, this end comes with a rubber O-ring inside, and this actually spins, and you're able to not have to put plumber's tape, Teflon tape on the thread of any pneumatic coupling bayonet. You're able to just put it straight on there, and there it is. No sealing tape required. So this hose is as flexible as the superfine hoses, and yet at the same time is much stronger, much longer lasting, has protective springs to stop the hose being damaged from dropped, and the compressor end doesn't require sealing tape for the bayonets when you attach them. Overall, this is an incredibly unusual airbrush, even though it doesn't look it. It has been made to look like a really old-fashioned, fully chrome-plated airbrush from the 1930s. And that's the look we were going for, a classic. something old-fashioned. And in many ways it is a return to old-fashioned values, in that it is an airbrush that has been designed to be long-lasting. It's been designed to be a workhorse airbrush in a Venturi classroom, where hundreds of people are hammering away at the airbrushes and dropping them and really pushing the limits of its resistance to breakage and wear and tear. We figure if we can design an airbrush that will survive our classrooms, then surely this is an airbrush that you guys are going to absolutely love and keep for a lifetime at home. And so that's what this airbrush is all about. Thank you.